Welcome back to Walt Disney and American Original. Today we'll be doing Section 4, Chapter 24. The 5 years that followed the opening of Disneyland were a period of great expansion for Walt Disney Productions, which had begun by the 1950s with a gross income of $6 million and had leapt to $27 million in the first year of Disneyland operation. By the end of the decade, the figure was $70 million. Television production grew with the introduction of the 1957 of the third series, Zorro. The project had been transferred to the studio from WED, and the half-hour adventure proved to be popular attraction on the ABC network. Disneyland continued to be the top-rated series in television. In the second season, Walt produced 2 more adventure episodes starring Fess Parker as Davy Crockett, again a television sensation and a moneymaker in the theaters. The second season of the Mickey Mouse Club was more successful than the first. After 2 seasons of losing to Disneyland in the ratings, NBC scheduled the most expensive series in television, an hour-long western, Wagon Train. NBC lavished promotion on the show, and it succeeded in toppling Disneyland from its number 1 position. ABC, which was having success with Hollywood-made western series such as Cheyenne, Maverick, and Wyatt Earp, began importuning Disney. Give us more westerns! Give us more action! A meeting was scheduled with top ABC officials at the Disney studio. Walt startled them by appearing at the conference room in full cowboy regalia. He twirled 6 shooters and laid them down on the table. "Okay, you want westerns? You're gonna get westerns," he exclaimed, but he insisted he was going to do the westerns his way, depicting the true heroes in the true West. He recounted tales of Texas John Slaughter and Alfego Baca, and the ABC executives were totally convinced. Walt disliked being forced to turn out product to fit an audience formula. He found himself competing with 24 other television westerns, and that wasn't the Disney style. He argued that his product had always succeeded by its uniqueness, not in following trends. But ABC told him, "Just keep giving us westerns." Despite its immense popularity, the Mickey Mouse Club ran into trouble. ABC claimed it couldn't find enough sponsors who wanted to appeal to the juvenile audience, and the show was cut to a half hour for its 3rd season, then discontinued. It had been a brave experiment to attempt to present important programming to the young television audience. Never again would it be done in commercial television. What killed the Mickey Mouse Club? Walt Disney hinted that it was greed. He believed the network's overloading of commercials caused viewers to lose interest. The Zorro series had been an acknowledged hit for 2 seasons, but ABC declined to renew it. The reason was economic. The network could make more money with series which it owned rather than those bought from independent producers. In canceling the series, ABC contended that Disney was barred from offering Zorro or the Mickey Mouse Club to other networks. Walt and Roy considered that unfair. They sued ABC, and after a lengthy negotiation, a settlement was reached. Disney would be able to take Walt Disney Presents, as it was called in its last 2 seasons on ABC, to another network. Disney would buy out ABC's 1/3 interest in Disneyland for $7.5 million. The settlement galled Walt. What did they do to help build the place? But at least he was free. The purchase from ABC in 1960 gave Walt Disney Productions total ownership in Disneyland, the interests of Walt Disney in Western printing having been acquired earlier. When Walt returned from New York after the ABC settlement, he called Don Tatum, former ABC West Coast television head who had joined the Disney organization in 1955. "Now we can go to an NBC and talk about color," Walt said. From the beginning of his career in television, Walt was convinced that the medium would someday move to color. Even though ABC had telecast his shows in black and white, all of the new material was filmed in color. Other Hollywood producers considered that an unwise extravagance, but Walt was certain that color would add future value to the shows. NBC was the obvious place for him to test his theory. The network was promoting color because its parent company, RCA, manufactured color television sets. Tatum telephoned NBC president Robert Kittner, who expressed immediate interest in a color television series by Disney. Both Walt and Roy Disney went to New York with Card Walker and Don Tatum for the meeting with the RCA NBC officials. The RCA boardroom in Rockefeller Center was decorated with brightly colored posters created by Disney artists, and Walt proceeded from one to the next, relating each story with emphasis on the use of color. It was a virtuoso performance, and the television executives were overwhelmed. All that remained was to work out the final details. When Walt dropped Walker and Tatum off at their hotel, he told them, "Fellas, I want this deal. If necessary, I'll stand on my head in Macy's window." Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color made its debut on September 24, 1961, with a new character, Ludwig von Drake, lecturing on how the Disney cartoons moved from silence to sounds and from black and white to color. It was the beginning of a long and profitable relationship between Disney and NBC. One day, when the studio burden seemed overwhelming, Walt muttered to his secretary, Dolores Walt Scott, "Let's shut down this office. We've got Disneyland. We don't need the studio." He wasn't serious, but it was an indication of his feelings about Disneyland. On one of his tours of the park with Joe Fowler, he remarked, "This is where I can get a real rest away from the humdrum of making pictures at the studio. This is my amusement area." During the winter months when Disneyland was closed to the public on Monday and Tuesday, he inspected the refurbishings and buildings of new attractions, but he also liked to see how people were reacting to the park, and he usually toured the park every Saturday. Mobility became a problem since television had made him readily recognizable. He seemed to enjoy the recognition, but he grew impatient with requests for autographs. Once, when a grandmotherly tourist asked if he would give her an autograph, he replied, "No, but I'll give you a kiss." And he did. Sometimes he answered requests by handing out slips of papers on which he had previously signed his name. Occasionally there were hurt feelings at when a mother wrote to Walt complaining that he refused to sign her daughter's autograph book. He replied in a letter, "It isn't that I object to giving my autograph to fans while in the park, but I have found that if I stop to sign autograph books, etc. for the youngsters, I usually get inundated with them and never get to where I was going nor accomplish what I had set out to do. So when they stop me, I ask them to send me a note at the studio and their request will be fulfilled. This saves me endless time. If I fail to ask Tricia to do this, I am sorry, but perhaps you will give the enclosed autographed photo taken of me and my little pet poodle late." During his visits to Disneyland, Walt was always pussing, looking for ways to improve the appearance of Disneyland and provide more pleasure for the customers. He would study an area and tell his staff, "Let's get a better show for the customers. What can we do to give this place interest?" One Sunday, Nick Nunes, manager of Frontierland, was making out the weekly work schedule at the Chicken Plantation restaurant when Walt came by on a strolling survey. The two men studied the traffic on the rivers of America. The Mark Twain was pulling away from the dock. One keelboat was landing at the pier as another departed. 2 rafts were crossing to Tom Sawyer's Island, and 3 canoes were racing around the bend. "Look at that!" Walt exclaimed. Nunes expected him to complain about the congestion, but Walt said, "Now there's a busy river. What we need is another boat." The astonished Nunes asked him what kind of boat. "Not just another stern-wheeler," Walt replied. This time we need a sailing ship. I think we should have a replica of the Columbia. Did you know that was the first American vessel to sail around the world?" He delivered a history of the Columbia, which became the next addition to the Rivers of America. As the principal features of the Tahitian Terrace, which featured Polynesian dancers and entertainment, the Disney engineers had created a huge tropical tree of cement limbs and plastic leaves. When Walt first saw the tree in the restaurant, he commented, "Trunk squatty!" He climbed to the highest terrace and gazed at the stage. "You can't see the show from up here. The foliage is in the way." He said, "Let's do something about it." After weeks of study, the engineers met with Walt at the Tahitian Terrace and confessed their inability to raise the tree without great expense. Walt studied the huge tree and remarked, "This may sound silly, but why can't we just add 6 feet to the trunk?" That solved the problem. The trunk was severed, the tree raised by a crane, and 6 feet of cement and steel were added to the trunk. Walt could be severe with employees who disturbed what he was trying to create at Disneyland. He reprimanded a publicity man for parking his car near the Frontierland Railroad station. "When people come here, they expect to see the frontier," Walt said. "Your car destroys the whole illusion. I don't ever want to see a car inside the park again." Illusion was everything. A Disneyland television show was proposed in which Walt would soliloquize about the park as he walked down the deserted Main Street. Walt killed the idea in storyboard. "I don't ever want people to see the park empty," he said. One evening, Walt and Lily were stopped by a guard while approaching a preview of the Monsanto exhibit. When Walt explained who he was, the guard said, "All right, you can go in, but she can't." Walt later ordered the guard fired. "If he treats me that way, imagine how he'll be with other people." Early in the operation of the park, he decided that Disneyland would have to train its own security people rather than use an outside agency. "You can't expect outsiders to give the courtesy that we want," he said. "We want the people who come here treated as guests, not customers." Walt noticed that one of the railroad conductors treated the patrons curtly. He commented to an assistant, "See if you can't give that fellow a better understanding of the business we're in. Try to cheer him up. If you can't, then he shouldn't be working here. Well, we're selling happiness. We don't want sourpusses here." Walt often stopped to chat with ride operators about their problems. The more perceptive employees learned to recognize the nature of his visit to the park from his attire. If he wore a gray suit and sports shirt with his smoke tree ranch neckerchief, he was there for pleasure. When he was on a business tour, he wore an old pair of gray pinstripe trousers, an ancient leather jacket, a pair of clodhoppers, and a farmer's straw hat. In his business clothes, he sometimes went unrecognized by Disneyland workers. One day, a Jungle Cruise boat pilot failed to notice that he had a famous passenger. When Walt stepped off the boat, he walked up to the Frontierland superintendent, Dick Nunes, and said, "What's the trip time on this ride?" Nunez replied that it was 7 minutes. I just got a 4.5-minute trip, Walt said. How would you like to go to a movie and have the theater remove a reel in the middle of the picture? Do you realize how much those hippos cost? I want people to see them, not be rushed through a ride by some guy who's bored with his work. Could I go on a trip with you? Nunez asked. He and Walt rode one of the boats through Adventureland, and Walt explained how to conduct the trip. Speed up in the dull stretches, then slow down when you have to something to look at. For a full week, the Jungle Cruise pilots were timed with stopwatches until they perfected the length of the trip. When Walt arrived for his regular visit to Disneyland on the weekend, he walked through Adventureland without stopping. He did the same the following weekend. After 3 weeks, he took a ride on the Jungle Cruise. When he returned to the dock, he entered the next boat for another ride. He ran around 4 times, eliminating the possibility the operators had stacked the deck by giving him the best pilots. When he emerged from the 4th trip, he provided his only comment, a thumbs-up sign to Nunez. Tomorrowland remained a vexation to Walt. It had been neglected in the original plan because of a lack of time and money. In 1959, Walt corrected the lapse with a $6 million improvement of the Tomorrowland area. The initial Disneyland plans included a monorail sweeping over the park, but the WED engineers couldn't lick construction problems. A couple of years after Disneyland had opened, Joe Fowler and Roger Bogie visited a monorail prototype in Cologne, Germany. Unlike other models in which the car was suspended from the rail, this one rode piggyback, rubber wheels rolling noiselessly on a concrete ribbon. When Fowler and Bogie explained how the ride worked, Walt decided that was what he wanted. Another addition for Tomorrowland was an underwater ride. The WED planners had suggested a glass-bottomed boat, but Walt said, "No, let's give them a real submarine ride. We'll take them down in the water and let them look out of the portholes. Give them a real show." The planners devised mock-ups of submarine ports and tested underwater stunts of giant squids, volcanic fire, etc. It all seemed feasible, and the submarine voyage was put into production. The United States Navy expressed a desire to sponsor the ride, but Walt declined, fearing interference if he became involved with government bureaucracy. Instead, the General Dynamics Corporation became the sponsor. The Matterhorn ride originated one day when Walt and Joe Fowler were sitting atop the wooded hill in the middle of Disneyland. "You know, Joe," Walt began, "why don't we make some snow and have a toboggan ride here?" Fowler explained that it would be difficult to maintain the snow, especially in the summertime. Water drainage would also be a problem. Walt gave up the snow idea. Instead, he built a replica of the Matterhorn with bobsleds racing through and around it. The opening in June 1959 of the Matterhorn, the Disneyland Alweg monorail system, and the submarine voyage, plus a motorboat cruise and a revamp of Autopia, provided much-needed capacity for growing crowds. In the 4 years since the opening, Disneyland had attracted 15 million visitors. Still, Walt rejected complacency. When an elaborate Christmas parade was proposed, members of the park operating committee spoke against it. They argued that it would be poor economics to spend $350,000 on a parade when holiday crowds would be attracted to Disneyland with or without the attraction. Walt rejected their arguments, declaring, "We can't be satisfied. Even though we'll get the crowds at Christmas time, we've always got to give them a little more. It'll be worth the investment. If they ever stop coming, it'll cost 10 times that much to get them back." During the first season, Walt offered a circus that proved a failure. The tent seated 2,000 and no more than 500 appeared at any performance. "People don't come to Disneyland to see a circus," Walt concluded, and he shut it down. The stagecoach ride had become a safety problem. The horses ran away 3 times and the top-heavy coach spilled. Joe Fowler suggested allowing no passengers on top of the coach. "If people can't ride on top, it's no show," replied. "Let's discontinue it." Walt's biggest disappointment was the periphery of Disneyland. Motels and restaurants sprang up with eye-catching signs and sales gimmicks to attract the Disneyland millions. "I wanted to buy more land, but I couldn't," Walt told a reporter. "I had a hell of a time raising the money as it was. I even put my family in hock by borrowing on my life insurance and stock. Believe me, if I ever built another Disneyland, I would make sure I could control the class and the theme of the enterprises around it." Theatrical features remained the principal enterprise of Walt Disney Productions, and they thrived in the years following the opening of Disneyland. Walt Disney became the envy of other film producers because of his ability to pre-sell his movies on the television show, assured of a faithful audience that recognized the Disney trademark for wholesome entertainment. Producers were also envious of the gold that Disney could mine from his film vaults. Ever since Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, he had designed the cartoon features to be timeless in nature. Thus, they were unaffected by the transition of styles and could be released to each new generation. Buena Vista began the practice of bringing back the Disney classics every 7 years. Since the production costs on most of the features had already been paid, the releases represented almost total profit. Walt was especially pleased when features that had failed in their first releases finally achieved vindication. When Card Walker told him the 1957 re-release of Bambi would earn $2 million, Walt reflected. You know, Card, I think back to 1942 when we released that picture and there was a war on, and nobody cared much about the love life of a deer, and the bankers were on my back. It's pretty gratifying to know that Bambi finally made it. Walt saw a wider range of film material, and he bristled when the story department rejected a book because it was not Disney material, implying that it wouldn't appeal to children. Damn it, I'm making pictures for the family, not just children, he declared. If I made pictures only for children, I'd lose my shirt. Old Yeller marked a step toward greater realism in Disney films. The Fred Gibson story of life on a Texas farm in 1869 had been serialized in Collier's magazine and became a best-selling book. Excuse me. Bill Anderson thought it held promise as a Disney film. He also believed it could provide his chance to become a producer. Anderson arrived at the studio during the war and had risen to become production manager of the studio. Anderson poured out his enthusiasm for Old Yeller to Walt. That was a mistake. Walt did not like to be oversold on anything, and he viewed Anderson's pitch with a suspicious stare. Anderson continued his campaign, fearing that Walt would leave for Europe before reading the Gibson story. At 8 o'clock on Sunday morning of his departure, Walt awoke Anderson with a telephone call. You buy that story, Walt ordered. Don't let anybody get in your way. Buy that story, and since you're bugging me on this, we'll see what kind of producer you are. You can be my associate on this picture. The rights to Old Yeller were purchased for $50,000, and Fred Gibson came to the studio to adapt his own story. A Hollywood writer enlarged the story, and Walt was displeased with it. In the book, the father of the family had left the farm for a cattle drive and was absent during the events of the summer. The cattle drive was added to the script since the father was to be portrayed by Fess Parker. It seemed impractical to have the studio's important star appear only at the beginning and the end. The cattle drive will have to go, Walt decided, and one afternoon he eliminated 35 pages from the script, inserting dialogue from the book. We bought this book because we liked it, he reasoned. Why change it? In the book, the boy was forced to shoot his beloved dog because it had been bitten by a rabid wolf. Members of the production staff argued that such an ending would be too tragic for children. This is a Texas farm in 1869. The dog has rabies. There's no way he can be saved, Walt argued. You gotta shoot him. It'll give the picture a touch of realism. The kids will cry, but it's important for them to know that life isn't all happy endings. Walt chose an Englishman, Robert Stevenson, to direct Old Yeller. He had been brought to America by David O. Selznick and later made films for Howard Hughes at RKO. Walt admired one of Stevenson's television films and assigned him to direct a Revolutionary War film, Johnny Tremaine, despite the director's English background. Walt's faith in Stevenson was justified. Old Yeller made a bigger profit than any previous live-action Disney film. The Shaggy Dog had been around the Disney studio since the 30s. It originated with the novel The Hound of Florence by Felix Salten, author of Bambi. The original plot concerned an apprentice of Michelangelo who turned into a dog, and in 1941, Walt designed it to be the studio's first live-action film. In a letter to George Schaefer, president of RKO, Walt suggested that the film could be done in a high-class manner with a fairly good cost, for less than $400,000. I believe it's the type of thing that would have the same appeal as Topper, the Invisible Man, and other of those unusual pictures that have been so successful. The project lapsed with the outbreak of the war. In 1957, Walt asked Bill Walsh to hunt for film subjects to showcase the popular stars of the Mickey Mouse Club. Walt suggested updating The Hound of Florence with Tommy Kirk as a teenager transforming into a shaggy dog by a mystic ring. The project was proposed to ABC as a television series. It was turned down as being too far-fetched. All right, to hell with those guys, said Walt. We'll make it as a feature. He assigned Bill Walsh and Lily Hayward to write the script, and Walt worked closely with them, contributing comedy business from his long experience with cartoons. For director, he chose Charles Barton, a veteran of movie comedy. As father of the boy dog, Walt cast Fred McMurray, whose career had declined to the making of routine westerns. The budget was established at a modest $1.2 million, and Walt decided to make the Shaggy Dog in black and white. He reasoned that color would add a disturbing note of reality to the supernatural comedies. The Shaggy Dog proved a surprising success, earning more than $9.5 million on the United States and Canada. It was an important film for the studio's history, proving that Disney could be as effective in live-action comedy as in cartoons. Fred McMurray's career was re-established, and he served as star of a succession of Disney comedies. Walt was already planning another one during the filming of The Shaggy Dog. He visited the set one day and told McMurray about a demonstration he had seen at the Brussels World Fair. A science professor from an eastern U.S. college had used puffs of carbon dioxide gas and other dramatic devices to illustrate the interaction of elements. That was the inspiration of McMurray's second Disney film, The Absent-Minded Professor. Sleeping Beauty was put into production at a time when Walt was thoroughly engrossed in Disneyland, television, and the live-action films. He kept an eye on the cartoon's progress, but he lacked time to lavish on his preparation, as he had done all the previous features. As a result, the characters lacked the human touches that Walt always endowed. They also lacked his humor. The emphasis was on visual beauty and spectacular effects. Sleeping Beauty continued in production for 3 years, and its cost mounted to an alarming $6 million. I sort of got trapped, Walt admitted later. I had passed the point of no return and had to go forward with it. Sleeping Beauty lost money in its first release, and other Disney features, Darby O'Gill and the Little People, Third Man on the Mountain, Toby Tyler, Kidnapped, performed disappointingly at the box office. Another disappointment was Pollyanna. It was a beautifully wrought film written and directed by David Swift, with warm sentiment and starring a brilliant young actress, Hayley Mills, daughter of the British star John Mills. Despite its excellence, Pollyanna earned less than $1 million. Walt theorized that he should have changed the title. The male segment of the film audience apparently balked at seeing a movie called Pollyanna. Walt Disney Productions, which had a record profit of $3.4 million for the fiscal year 1958 and 59, suffered a loss of $1.3 million the following year, largely because of the cost of Sleeping Beauty. It was the first time in a decade that the company had lost money, and Walt found that he had to boost studio morale. He told his staff, "Look, we've been through this before. Why, we were just one step ahead of foreclosure when we lost our foreign market before the war. We might have gone under after the war if the bank hadn't agreed to carry us. We'll get out of this slump too." The reverse came soon. Walt authorized his biggest budget for a live-action feature, $4.5 million for Swiss Family Robinson. He put $3.6 million into his first cartoon features with a contemporary story, 101 Dalmatians. Fred MacMurray starred in The Absent-Minded Professor, Hayley Mills in a second film written and directed by David Swift, The Parent Trap. The 4 films produced a total profit of $19 million. On April 25, 1961, Walt and Roy Disney marked a historic occasion in the history of their company. The loan from the Bank of America was finally paid off. For the first time in 22 years, revenue from the motion pictures would go directly to Walt Disney Productions instead of the bank. Thank you very much for your time. You are always a pleasure, and your time is very valuable to me. And remember, today's special moments are tomorrow's memories.